I'm Fadl Abdelghani, the Executive Director of Syria Network for Human Rights. I welcome you to our annual event on human rights in our country, Syria. Despite being one of the worst human rights situations in the world, it often doesn't receive the necessary attention. This international event on the sideline of ONGA meetings aim to remind the world of the suffering of Syrian people and bring the Syria issue back to international spotlight. This international event has been held since 2014 and has continued. In the past 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022, we organized it online, but we are pleased this year to see it return its physical format as it was. This event organized in coordination and cooperation with the US State Department. I extended my heartfelt thanks to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor for their significant contribution to organization, especially Sofia Smadi, who has put in tremendous efforts. I also want to express my gratitude to the sponsoring countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Qatar, for their support of our work. Your event sponsorship shows that you are committed to human rights in Syria. Now I give the floor to the moderator, Utaiba. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Fadl. Thank you so much, Fadl. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm honored to be here on behalf of myself and on behalf of the Atlantic Council. And I want to thank government representatives here from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Qatar for being here. But most importantly, I want to thank Syrian civil society representatives here on the panel and also Syrians watching online for their bravery, for continuing to do the important work that they are doing. Without them, I think none of us here would be able to carry this work. 12 years into the conflict, the government of Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad continues to take the lead, not in helping Syrians have a better life, but in making their lives more miserable. Instead of releasing the fate of over 130,000 people still detained in Syria, this government of Syria continues to disappear more. Instead of allowing a safe and neutral environment for refugees to return to their homes, it continues to displace more. And instead of helping rebuild the homes destroyed by the Syrian government war on its own people, by the earthquake of February earlier this year, the Assad government continues to bomb areas in northwest Syria to kill and destroy more. It is that specific behavior, and it's the complete lack of accountability for over 12 years of war crimes and human rights violations that encourages other parties to the conflict to pursue similar behavior, even if it is on smaller scale. 12 years into the conflict, the government of Syria continues to be very explicit. It believes only in a military violence solution. And it continues to express its intention to conquer every last square inch of Syria. And it does not care what is left of Syria and Syrians in pursuing that solution. As we stand here today, Assad is getting a good night's sleep in China as he prepares to meet his counterparts from the CPP and PRC authorities in a show of solidarity. It is my hope today that we show our solidarity with the Syrian people, not only through statements, but through our commitment for accountability for all Syrians and for all the war crimes and human rights violations committed against Syrians in the last 12 plus years. With that, I invite Ms. Erin Barclay, U.S. Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, to give the opening remarks. Oh, yes. Sorry. I was told to hold to that mic with my life.
It's like a holiday dinner at my house. Pass the stuffing. Okay. Okay. All right. Great. I'm loud, but I can be louder if you can't hear me. So please let me know. So good afternoon, everyone. It really is an honor to be back together with you. we were reminiscing, Abdul and I were, about the last time we convened the group was in March and we did it online. And it's really great to be together in person. I, for one, missed that during the course of the last couple of years. So it's really great to be with all of you. I also want to join in my thanks to my counterparts on the panel here from Germany and France and the UK and Qatar for co-hosting this important event with us today. And as has already been said, I'm deeply grateful to civil society who are here and who are also online, as well as the UN Committee of Inquiry on Syria, for sharing again your thoughts, your experiences. For sharing your thoughts and experiences on this important panel. Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. So March 2023 marked 12 long years since the Assad regime began its violent suppression of peaceful protests in Syria. Despite egregious abuses and violations over the ensuing years, Syrian human rights defenders continue to bravely demand their universal human rights. We've seen this demand for freedom and dignity during recent weeks of protests and across all parts of the country. The United States has stood with Syrians since 2011, and we will continue to do so. When we talk about the Assad regime's brutality, arbitrary detentions, disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings, we are sadly not just referring to things that happened in the early years of the revolution. These abuses continue every day, including today. Not even the devastating earthquakes in February could stop the Assad regime and Russia from continuing to bombard camps for displaced persons, causing many casualties. While Assad claims that Syria will welcome back refugees from neighboring countries, it's clear that the conditions do not exist for the safe and dignified return of those who have been displaced. Forcibly displaced Syrians face significant risks of abuses if they return, even in cases where reconciliation agreements were in place. And many have nowhere to return to as a result of widespread destruction or the regime's confiscation of their property. During 2023 alone, SNHR documented regime arrests of at least 112 Syrians returning to the country, including women and children. They also reported that 24 of these individuals have been subjected to enforced disappearances. It's clear that Syrians continue to suffer horrific human rights abuses, and the regime's allies continue to shield it from facing accountability. We will continue our unwavering effort in coordination with our allies and partners to hold all perpetrators of these abuses in Syria to account. Just last month, the United States sanctioned 2 armed Syrian National Army factions implicated in human rights abuses in northwest Syria, including sexual violence against women. The U.S. will not cease our support for the Syrian people. We will not normalize relations with the Assad regime, and we will continue to promote respect for the dignity and human rights of all Syrians. This includes providing support to Syrian civil society organizations that are pursuing accountability by documenting atrocities, assisting victims, and seeking to determine the status, fate, and whereabouts of the 155,000 missing and unjustly detained persons. We welcome the General Assembly's recent establishment of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria, which it was built on many years of leadership and advocacy from Syrian civil society, from victims and survivors groups, and from family associations. We will continue to coordinate with the UN and member states and Syrian stakeholders to ensure this new entity fulfills its humanitarian mandate in a way that is victim and survivor-centric, and importantly, gender inclusive. We call on all parties to the conflict to engage this new UN entity in good faith and to help advance the right to know the truth so that families, most importantly, the families, can get the answers they have long deserved. So in conclusion, for us today, I think is a very important opportunity to take stock of our collective efforts to respond to the ongoing human rights violations and abuses that Syrians continue to face 12 years into this conflict. As we do so, we need to think very carefully as the international community about how we can do better to advance justice and accountability against those who have blood on their hands in this conflict. So again, let me warmly thank members of Syrian civil society for sharing your challenges with us, for sharing your stories, that of your colleagues and your fellow Syrians. I have to, of course, acknowledge that sharing these stories over and over and over again takes an emotional and a mental toll on people. I really want to applaud and thank your bravery and your willingness for continuing to speak out to the international community about your own experiences and about what is happening in Syria. As I've said to other colleagues over the course of the last week, we take that as a serious responsibility on our part to put your experiences, your stories, your insights to good work for peace and reconciliation in Syria. So let me just stop by saying thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Erin. I invite Ethan Goldrich, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, to deliver his intervention on behalf of the United States.
Okay, thank you very much, Kuteba, and thank you, Fadl, Acting Assistant Secretary Barkley. Good afternoon, everybody. Masal khair. Let me, what's that? Yeah. Soon. So I want to thank the Syrian Network for Human Rights and also colleagues that are here from the United Kingdom, Germany, and France for co-hosting today's event on human rights abuses and violations in Syria. And I also want to thank the Syrian civil society organizations that have joined us today. And I'm honored to be here with you and to reaffirm the United States' commitment to working with you and the Syrian people to promote justice and accountability. 12 years on, the long list of human rights violations committed in Syria remains utterly shocking. Bombardments, chemical weapons attacks, enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, and forced displacement are just a fraction of the many atrocities the Syrian people have had to endure, and that they continue to suffer today. There should be no impunity for the individuals who ordered and carried out these transgressions, no matter who they are or where they live. Acting Assistant Secretary Barkley has already described our many efforts in the human rights space. What I want to stress today is that accountability remains central to the political process that Syrians want and deserve. Without equal justice for all, there cannot be an enduring peace in Syria, nor can we achieve the safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable returns of Syrian refugees. Recent political developments may cause some to question how we can achieve justice and accountability, but the United States has not and will not give up this vital effort, which remains one of the pillars of our policy. We are not giving up because the Syrian people themselves are still demanding dignity, freedom, security, and justice, as we have seen during the ongoing courageous and peaceful protests in Suwaida and Daraa. Will not normalize relations with the Assad regime or lift sanctions on Syria unless and until there is authentic and enduring progress toward a political solution to the conflict in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. We will also keep engaging our allies and partners to make sure they understand the connection between this political solution and justice and accountability. We have not forgotten the crimes that the Assad regime committed against the Syrian people, and we will press other governments not to forget them either. In this process, we will rely on you, our friends in civil society, to keep us informed and to keep us honest. And together, we will achieve a better future for the Syrian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Des Goldrich. I want to pass the mic to Ambassador Delphine Bourillon, France's Ambassador at Large for Human Rights, to deliver France's interview.
Thank you. Thank you very much, distinguished participants and guests. It's such an honor to be here to deal with this so important issue. So thank you very much, the State Department, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, for hosting this event. And we are very happy with other colleagues to co-host it. Your intervention, as the context that we know, is marked by the last report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry that reminded us last week that grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law continued across Syria. The United Nations has extensively documented the regime's systematic use of torture, sexual violence against women, children, and men in the prisons under its control. And Syria is not a safe place to return. The recent crimes committed in Ukraine by Russia, using the same methods used by the regime in Syria, reminds us that the absolute imperative to fight relentlessly against impunity wherever it is necessary. Those responsible must be held accountable for their acts. This is necessary if Syria is to rebuild itself socially and politically. The future of a rules-based international order is also at stake. And in this challenging international context, I want to strongly reaffirm France's long-standing commitment to the fight against impunity in Syria. There are several ways to ensure accountability for these crimes, some of which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And France is deeply and firmly determined to explore all of them. Let me give you some insight of the actions taken. First, we strongly support the work of the Commission of Inquiry, as well as the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism. Documenting the crimes perpetrated in Syria is essential to help investigating and prosecuting them. Last year, France completed the last legislative step in order to approve the International Judicial Cooperation Convention between our government and the Triple IM. We also welcome the recent establishment of the Independent Institution Missing Persons in Syria in June 2023, which aims to clarify the fate and whereabouts of all missing persons in the country and provide adequate support to victims, survivors, and the families of those missing. Second, efforts to ensure individual criminal accountability for international crimes also continued, and we support the work of national courts, which are mobilized in this field, such as the Koblenz Tribunal, which issued a historic judgment in January 2022. Judicial proceedings are also underway in France, and trials will take place in May next year. Moreover, last year, the Ministry of European Foreign Affairs submitted to the French judiciary hundreds of photos and videos that we have received and that provide evidence of atrocities committed by pro-regime forces during the 2013 Tadamon massacre in Damascus. The alleged actions are likely to constitute the most serious international crimes, specifically crimes against humanity and war crimes. Last May, our highest appeal court, the Cour de Cassation, has ruled on how universal jurisdiction is to be exercised in France. The court's interpretation allows our jurisdictions to continue to prosecute alleged perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. In July, a former leader of Jaish al-Islam was committed to trial on war crimes charges. Third, We are dedicated to condemn the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons against its population. We supported the decision of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Conference of the State Parties to suspend Syria's rights and privileges under the CWC 2 years ago. We launched and chair the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons, which today brings together 40 states and European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the fight against impunity is a matter of justice for the victims. It is also an essential prerequisite for building a lasting peace in Syria, along with a political solution in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. On 8 June 2023, Canada and the Netherlands instituted proceedings against the Syrian Arab Republic before the International Court of Justice for violations of the Convention Against Torture, which the Commission has excessively documented. This landmark proceeding to hold the state of the Syrian Arab Republic accountable for the tens of thousands of people who have been tortured and ill-treated in government detention facilities is a welcome step. Let me finish by commending the heroic efforts of human rights defenders and NGO personnel, many of whom are present today. Thank you. They risk their lives to bring to light the truth about the crimes committed in Syria. We have also to support and protecting these human rights defenders, and France is also committed to do it. It is our shared responsibility to make sure that these efforts are not in vain and that Syrian people's aspirations for freedom, dignity, and justice are fully met. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bouillon. I invite Mr. Muhammad Ali Hassan Al-Hamadi, Qatar's Director of the US and Americas Department, to deliver remarks on behalf of the State of Qatar.
Thank you, Qutaiba. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I'm pleased to join distinguished colleagues from United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and France. I also thank the distinguished panelists for bringing the international spotlight of the situation of the Syrian brothers and sisters. It is due to our moral obligation towards them that we are taking part in organizing this event, as well as due to our wider commitment to the promotion of human rights and justice everywhere. As His Highness the Emir of State of Qatar said 2 days ago at the General Assembly, we should not accept as inevitable fate the injustice suffered by the brotherly Syrian people. The humanitarian and human rights aspect of the Syrian crisis have since the beginning been priority for the State of Qatar, which has and continues to be a leading provider of assistance, including during this year's Brussels conference and following the devastating earthquake. Urgent humanitarian and human rights concerns should be addressed as a priority, especially the persisting issues. One of the most concerning issues is that of the missing persons, which to date causes tremendous suffering. That is why we have expressed support for the recommendations in the UN Secretary General's report on this matter, with a view to clarify the fate and whereabouts of persons believed to be missing and providing support to victims, survivors, and their families. One of the most important issues for the State of Qatar, as I'm sure it is for all of you, is the abuses and violations against children. Here, I would like to highlight that last May, my country led an Arab consensus on the adoption of Doha Declaration by regional conference on the prevention of grave violations against children in armed conflicts. I would also like to highlight that the recent opening of Doha office of the United Nations Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. We believe that accountability and reconciliation remain essential for lasting peace. That was the reason behind Qatar's pioneering work to establish supporting the International Independent Investigation Mechanism, the IIIM. This entity has been making commendable achievements to fulfill its mandate, and serve the agenda of justice and the prospects of peace and reconciliation. The concrete results are demonstrated by the high number of requests for assistance, and it is receiving from the different competent jurisdictions to help investigate and prosecute core international crimes committed in Syria. There is a need for confidence building measures to ensure and facilitate safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees and internally displaced persons. Addressing these issues and, in general, the root causes of humanitarian crises is essentially to pave the way towards final resolution, early recovery, and reconstruction. Finally, the comprehensive settlement of the crisis is surely the best way out of the dire situation that we are discussing in this meeting. The settlement needs to be achieved through political process leading to a political transition in accordance with Geneva I Communique and Security Council Resolution 2254, which would realize the aspirations of the Syrian people and preserve the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I would like to invite Ms. Louise Amsberg, the German Federal Government Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Assistance, to deliver remarks on behalf of Germany.
So sorry, and thank you very much for bringing this event together today. I know it's always a little bit of a hassle to create an event during we're here in New York, but I have much respect for that. So thank you very much for inviting us and doing this with us together. And yeah, for having the opportunity to get a little bit into the issue and how it is also debated in Germany, since you know that we have a lot of refugees coming to us, living in our country, and of course are very vital in the debate, which for us as politicians is very helpful. So this event is important because not at least as a reminder of how dire the situation in Syria still is after 12 years, more than 12 years, which is, I think, incredible. And everyone who experienced the first days, weeks, and months of this war, who would have known that this will last so long? So this is always what comes up in me when we are talking about Syria, and it must make one emotional. So let me first of all say some words about what's politically going on at the moment, the normalization process region that saw a peak with Syria being readmitted to the Arab League earlier this year. We understand the concerns, especially of neighboring countries, but normalizing without getting tangible offers in return will not solve the problems, but only embolden Assad. So just to repeat the obvious here, the regime continues its repressive and criminal activities against its own population, as we have recently seen in Soweto, where the regime shot peaceful protesters. And we should not forget this. The dreadful situation once more shows the urgent need to work towards a political solution in line with UNSC Resolution 2254, which some colleagues mentioned earlier. And we therefore fully support UN Special Envoy Peterson and his efforts to energize the stalled political process. It is clearly not the time to rehabilitate Assad without any meaningful progress in the political process. So that is why we will continue to maintain our position in absence of a fundamental change of the side of the regime. No normalization, no reconstruction that benefits the regime, no lifting of sanctions. The sad truth is, 12 years into the conflict, not a single perpetrator of the horrible crimes has been brought to justice at international level. Despite all the evidence, which is currently at our disposal, yet there is reason for confidence. And I think you, Delphine, already mentioned this. In the absence of international justice, national jurisdiction have started to fill the gaps. Former officials of the Syrian regime's repression apparatus, members of Daesh and other terrorist groups are standing before courts or have already been sentenced, as it was the case in Germany, where the very small town of Koblenz, I don't know if you have heard about, but Koblenz became a symbol for the effectiveness and reality of universal law. Prosecutors in Germany and elsewhere continue to bring new cases to courts. So yes, universal jurisdiction can be a very effective and proportionate tool for pursuing accountability for the most serious crimes under international law. However, given the sheer scope of human rights violations in Syria, we must continue to press for all tangible ways to hold perpetrators accountable. And in this spirit, Germany continues to support all international accountability efforts, those of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, those of the Commission of Inquiry, of civil society organizations and relatives of the victims, to ensure that those responsible for torture, killing, and other atrocities in Syria will ultimately face justice. It's high time. And we also strongly support the implementation of the new UN mechanism on missing persons. And my colleagues mentioned that before. I think it's very crucial. It is imperative that the mechanism is set up swiftly as an independent international entity to support the search for the missing and families of survivors. It is a glimmer of hope for Syrian families looking for their missing relatives. As is well known, a large community, I mentioned that before, of Syrians has found refuge in Germany over the last decade. The human dimension of this tragedy of missing persons in Syria is something that is present in our political debate in Germany, very present. And of course, as politicians, we need to hear the voices of the family of victims, and they are loud and clear, and it cannot be stressed enough that by creating a mechanism for missing persons, we are responding to their immediate needs, and people also, people returning to Syria are disappearing. So it is really crucial that we find mechanisms and strengthen, since more than 120,000 Syrians from all over the country and from all political and religious backgrounds are still missing. And I will leave it at that because we will have a discussion, right? So afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I would like to invite Stephen Hickey, the United Kingdom's Director of Middle East and North Africa, to deliver his remarks on behalf of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Katiba, and thank you to everyone really for making time to be here today. I think it's so important that we're gathering here today and that we're focusing on human rights, justice and accountability in Syria, 12 years after the revolution began back in Syria. It's especially important given the very unfortunate trend of normalization among some states in the region with the Assad regime. It's especially important given that Syrians continue to endure just horrific human rights abuses, whether it's the bombardment that Syrians in the northwest are facing, or it's the continued torture, the forced disappearances or arbitrary arrests. I also think it's really important that we send collectively a signal to all Syrians, whether inside Syria, in the region or further afield, that we haven't forgotten, that we still care, that we'll continue to support Syrians, and that we'll work tirelessly to secure justice and accountability. I agree with everything that all the other excellent panelists have said already, so I won't repeat it. I might just touch briefly on a couple of themes. Look, first on refugees, I completely agree with Erin and Ethan that it's absolutely obvious to anybody that the conditions do not exist for safe and voluntary return of refugees or of IDPs to their homes. I think, though, at the same time, I think the international community, particularly Western donors, we do need to think creatively about how we can better support Syrians, particularly in the region, in Lebanon and Jordan and in Turkey. You know, our plan A that we all hope for, that refugees and IDPs will be able to return, hasn't succeeded. So I think we do need to think creatively about what more we can do. You know, just saying it's not safe for them to go back isn't a policy. It's not sufficient. So I think I welcome further thoughts from people here today about what more we can do. Second, on the question of normalization, just to be very clear, the UK will not normalize with the Assad regime. And, you know, for me, the whole phrase normalization and Assad, it really grates. How can it be normal to have relations or to welcome an individual or members of a regime that have killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians and continue to do so? I mean, the only thing that is normal is for these people to face justice and accountability. That's the normalization that I think about. But I always think at these events at UNGA, as well as I've just done, sound off a bit, I do also think it's really important to think about what are the concrete things we can do. And there's been some really excellent ideas already from all the members of the panel. I mean, I just sort of focus on 5 things. I'm conscious that all of these things are small and none of them are going to fix everything, but we have to exploit every single opportunity we've got. I mean, first, as I think Delphine and others have said, we have to work really closely with and support the independent institution on missing persons, which I think can make a real difference to the families that have missing people. Second, I think we have to keep up the pressure through multilateral institutions, through the UN Human Rights Council, through the General Assembly, and keep going in the Security Council. Even though, you know, we face vetoes, it's important to keep it on the agenda. We mustn't let the world forget about Syria as we deal with other crises. Third, I very much agree with both Louise and Delphine's. We need to do more to exploit national prosecutions of Syrians, using universal jurisdiction and working with our prosecutorial authorities in different countries to make that happen. I think there's a lot more we can do on that. Fourth, of course, we support the UN's work to try and get a political process going, although I am not optimistic at all. But as the UN implements a step-for-step process, and as the Arab League does step-for-step as well, and I very much appreciate the role of Qatar within the Arab League, incidentally, in making sure we don't forget human rights, I think it's important to make sure that any step-for-step has to include human rights and justice and accountability. It needs to be a central part of any step-for-step process. And then fifth, we must not forget the 4.5 million Syrians living in northwest Syria. I've already mentioned that obviously they face the regular bombardment by Assad's forces, but they also face human rights abuses from HTS and other authorities in the northwest. And I don't think we should forget them. And I think we need to use our collective influence to make sure we hold the authorities in the northwest to account as well for their performance on human rights. And as the international community looks to engage authorities in the northwest, we should make any improvement in international relations conditional on an improvement in the human rights situation there as well. Look, in conclusion, just to stress, we as the UK, and I know all the members of this panel, we will not forget Syria. We will not forget Assad's crimes and the crimes of his regime, and we will continue to support the Syrian people.
Thank you so much, Stephen. With that, allow me to transition to our panel. Do we have our guests online? Perfect. Then allow me to transition to Linnea Arvidsson from the United Nations Commission of Inquiry. Linnea, can you hear us well?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining. Taking in consideration the context we've talked about the intervention and remarks by government representatives here on the table. I want to ask you, especially concerning related to the Commission of Inquiry work, what are the most concerning trends of human rights violations or abuses that Syrians have been facing in this second decade of the conflict? What specific trends have COI have been monitoring and following in the last few years?
Thank you, Kutaiba, for that question, and good afternoon all. Many thanks for inviting the Commission and for this very pertinent question. It's a great pleasure to be here. So tomorrow morning, the Commissioners will be presenting our latest report to the UN's Human Rights Council here in Geneva. which is our third report in the last 3 months. We presented one in mid-June on the gendered impact of the conflict on women and girls, one in mid-July documenting torture over the past 3 years in Syria, and this new latest one focuses on violations committed in Syria since January this year. So these reports are the ones that I would rely on to answer your question. But first of all, I wanted to mention that we could not possibly do the work that we're doing without our cooperation with Syrian civil society organizations. And many of those are present at the event today. And their staff, as some already mentioned, are facing huge protection risks in order to carefully document violations on site, and they need all the support they can get, both financial and political. And it's quite extraordinary to see that where everyone else struggled, they managed to clarify cases of people missing and disappeared, and they found novel, groundbreaking ways of ensuring accountability despite all the challenges, and their work is just so essential for so many, including for us at the Commission. So on your question, our 3 new reports will speak to the continuing very concerning trends of violations, and right now, today, even though it's far away from the headlines across the country, Syrians continue to be killed, disappeared, tortured, arbitrarily detained, displaced, and dispossessed, primarily by state authorities, but also by the 3 other actors that are controlling a third of the territory, both HTS in the northwest, SNA, and the SDF in the northeast. And attacks by all parties continue to harm civilians. And a lot of you referred to the extraordinary fact that just weeks after the massive earthquakes of February, the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force resumed attacks on the very earthquake-affected northwest. We investigated dozens of such attacks so far this year, which injured and killed civilians and displaced thousands. And many of these attacks may constitute war crimes. We also continue to see civilians killed and injured in mutual attacks along the front lines in the northeast. And just last month, new clashes erupted in Deir ez-Zor between SDF and Arab tribes, which also killed dozens. And it has not been mentioned so much yet, but Daesh appears to be increasingly active and dangerous too. We saw brutal attacks in the central Syria desert this spring on truffle gatherers, where scores of civilians were shot, many at point-blank range, and insecurity of that nature also continues in southern Syria. In June, continued tensions in Daraa triggered airstrikes by the Syrian Air Force for the first time since 2018. The protests in Sueda, next door, against government policies, government violations, and ever deeper poverty are now in their 5th week. And they coincide with growing criticism across government-held areas where people are being detained merely for expressing their views online. This raises, of course, concern about whether protests may be violently repressed yet again. And on detention specifically, as you may have seen in our special report on torture from July, over the past 3 years, it's very, very clear that detainees in government detention facilities and military prisons continue to be held incommunicado without any access to their family, friends, and lawyers. They continue to be subjected to varied acts of torture and ill treatment. And most of the more than 100 former detainees that we spoke with described absolutely inhumane conditions of detention, lack of food, water, even basic sanitary facilities, widespread illness, and denial of medical care. And many saw fellow detainees die. And this is happening today. And such torture and ill treatment also persists in parts of Syria under the control of non-state armed groups, particularly against those perceived to be opposing the group in control, even though at a smaller scale. And a key concern, of course, is the Northeast, where 52,000 people, mainly women and young children, continue to be held in conditions that amount to inhuman treatment in the Al-Hol and Roj camps. And the Commission has called for all foreigners allegedly affiliated to Daesh and their families to be repatriated, including to hold alleged perpetrators among them accountable in domestic criminal proceedings where fair trial standards can be guaranteed and where caseloads are manageable. So this is another action that I would add to the excellent list that Stephen just had on things that need to be done. Across the country, State and non-state actors also continue to intimidate and harass activists and journalists. And in HTS-controlled areas, specifically, women activists and women's organizations are particularly threatened and subjected to hate speech, both off and online. We're also very worried about continued conscription-related violations as well as child recruitment, especially in the Northeast, where the Kurdish revolutionary youth continue to abduct boys and girls, despite very clear SDF commitments to prohibit child recruitment in the areas they control. And such child recruitment, as well as increasing child marriage, is also fueled by the ever-increasing poverty that Syria is experiencing. And with over 90% now living in poverty, and with women-headed households at particular risk, the Commission has recommended states that are imposing sectoral sanctions to review their impact on the lives of ordinary Syrians and humanitarian actors, including due to over-compliance, and in the meantime to maintain the helpful steps that were taken to ease sanctions in response to the earthquake. Obviously, with a dire situation right now in Syria, all parties simply must refrain from hindering humanitarian aid to those in need, and such aid would need to be stepped up also. A final point, since I'm running out of time, it should go without saying that it's deeply unsafe for Syrians to return to their country. And this year, yet again, we documented how refugees returning from neighboring countries were blackmailed, detained, ill-treated by Syrian security forces or criminal gangs operating with impunity. And some, including children, went missing. And instead of returning, today we're seeing Syrian youth fleeing in droves. They no longer feel that they have a future in their own country. And all of this is incredibly bleak, but to end on a positive note, as many of you, we were so very excited about the UN General Assembly's decision in June to create a dedicated institution of missing persons. And I wanted to thank everyone here who worked for that. And we, from our side in the Commission, we've already begun preparations to share information with the new institution in line with the informed consent provided by our sources. In order to really help contribute to resolve this national trauma that affects millions of Syrians. And we also look forward to continue to support the incredible efforts to achieve individual accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria jointly with the IIIM. And we particularly look forward to the initiation of proceedings at the International Court of Justice in The Hague in just 2.5 weeks, where the state of Syria will be required for the very first time to defend its record on torture. And all these positive developments have resulted from the efforts of Syrian human rights advocates in their incredibly impressive and tireless work. Thank you. And over to you, Taiba.
Thank you so much, Linya. Let me actually, transition from this grim picture of continuous violation, continuous trends of detentions, violations against refugees and returnees, harassment of journalists, forced conscription, including children and young girls. And I want to move this to your plate, Ahad, with all of those continuous trends for over a decade now. What unique challenges and risks do you see specifically facing women and girls in Syria? And what role you work with one of the Syrian American organizations, Multi-Faith Alliance, and you're engaged in many activities with Syrian civil society. What role do you see for Syrian civil society to reduce those risks on women and young girls, especially as we discuss increased risk on women, heads of households, on young girls being conscripted across areas of northern Syria? Let me give you. Just for our audience online. There is Arabic and yeah.
So first, I would like to thank the Syrian Network for Human Rights for co-organizing, and I would like to thank all the participants. I highly appreciate all your efforts on behalf of myself as a Syrian and of my fellow Syrians. Well, let me start actually to say what I came here to say. So I'm not here today to tell you how vulnerable and powerless Syrian women are, but I'm here to share with you and with everyone their strength and determination on many fronts. Despite the fact that the international community, and I'm deeply sorry to say that, but that's what we feel, We feel the international community has neglected our voices for 12 years. In 2011, Syrian women were and still present on forefront, participating against the Syria and protesting against the dictatorship, the Syrian regime and Bashar al-Assad, demanding an end to patriarchal system. And we demand justice and freedom, which we haven't seen in 12 years. As a result, they were detained and tortured, and their dignity were stripped away. They were left with physical and psychological traumas. And if they were fortunate enough to be released, let me actually share just a short story. A friend of mine who were detained, she used to describe her experience in really short sentence. And I'll quote her. The prison is like a cemetery for the living, except that they can't rest in peace. The end of quote. We know what is going on, and we know what is happening in Assad prison. And all what being said is the Russian and China preventing us from interfering or from taking any action. It reached a point where women are subjugated and violent and actually experience the violence and sexual abuse to be able to receive humanitarian aid. And all of this as a result of leniency from the international community to remove al-Assad regime from power. When I was working in Syria, distributing humanitarian aid before I came to the US, I met a brave mother of 3 children, whom I can and I will never forget. She told me, despite losing my husband in the Syrian regime prison, I have 3 children and they deserve to live, and I will never let them die of hunger, even if the price is my body. In the face of such atrocities, it is clear that the NGOs like ours partnering with governments should take action. Today at Multi-Faith Alliance, in addition to our distribution of humanitarian aid, we committed to improve reproductive health and access to nutrition for women in Northwest and Northeast Syria. We will establish a specialized women's healthcare center for and deployed health workers team to prevent and treat malnutrition for pregnant women. Just to conclude, let me emphasize that extraordinary resilience and the strength of the Syrian women. They have endured unimaginable hardship and injustice, and yet they continue fighting. And honestly, they are still hoping for better future. We would like you to stand with us and keep standing beside us, and to lend your ears to our voices. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I know we're going to get back to you in a second on some of the points you mentioned, but let me get to Fadl first. Fadl, it's in a chart. One of the main for people who are tracking detention in Syria, specifically on how unfortunately those numbers continue to increase over time. Even since quote-unquote reduction of hostilities in 2020. Right now, we have an independent institution for missing persons in Syria. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of reference on how the institution could be structured. But how can progress be made for the over 155,000 Syrians continue to be missing in Syria?
Thank you very much, Qutaiba. Missing person in Syria actually is a very complicated issue. Unlike it's some or a lot of activists dealing with it as a single aspect. So Yeah, we worked hard at Syrian Network for Human Rights to build this database. And this is the minimum bar, still in detention, 115,000 Syrians, which is makes Syria one of the worst or the worst country at the missing person. 112,000 approximately are the forcibly disappeared. 96,000 of them forcibly disappeared by the Syrian regime. So the Syrian regime is responsible for 85%. Among of those, 5,700 women. And that's, of course, the intensive nature. That means these crimes constitute to be crimes against humanity. How is the regime actually dealing with this dilemma? I think the regime has a strategy toward facing this tremendous figures. We succeed with supportive countries to have the figures of 100,000 forcibly disappeared Syrian citizens included in the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. And I would like always to express our gratitude to the Foreign Ministry of the US, Germany, France, the UK, Qatar, Denmark, Netherlands, and others who is endorsing these figures. Now we are working to increase because the case of disappearance is still going on and the figures became 112,000. So how is the Syrian regime is dealing with this issue? By 3 columns, I can say. The first one, the regime answering. I issued a lot of amnesty decrees. We analyzed all of amnesty decrees issued by Assad, and they are releasing only 7,400 individuals, while 135 remain imprisoned. So the Syrian regime needs approximately 200 years to release all the detainees, and even that could be only achieved if it ceases its continuing and arbitrary detention internally. And the most alarming development regarding the missing person in Syria, we discovered it by chance actually. We at Syrian Network for Human Rights got a source from inside the Assad regime, and we provided the name of the missing person inside the Assad regime civil registry, and we got a death statement. Those missing persons being killed, they are killed in due torture or due the condition in the Senate detention, and their families that they doesn't know. And we have 1,200 statements. We have hard copy ratified by the government. We have all of those outside Syria, and that's clear evidence that after the regime is killing those missing persons. So the regime is unable to reveal the fate or to release those missing persons because tremendous amount of those missing persons being killed. Few days ago, Qutayba, as you know, the regime abolished the infamous field military court. I don't believe this decision directly related to the Dutch-Canadian case at the International Court of Justice. Instead, I see it as a part of regime effort to eliminate the issue of enforced disappearance. We issued a report about the military court recently because the regime abolished those military courts. What we figured out in this report, which took from us 1 minute, we found that this court is responsible for 25% from the total disappearance in Syria. The total disappearance in Syria at the regime hand disappeared in those military court, and the military court is responsible for the death, the execution sentence for approximately 7,800 Syrian citizens, and we have those death sentences. I want to emphasize here a very crucial point our investigation led to. We made cross-checking between those death statements and the death certificate. We found out that 110 cases matching between those. So the regime actually doesn't have any response toward several Arab countries. The issue of missing persons being highlighted to the regime in Amman meeting, Cairo meeting, Jeddah. So the regime is preparing an answer. So Amnesty Degrees, death statement, a Polish death report is preparing an answer not for us, but maybe for some countries. They are willing to affiliate or reconnect with Assad. I don't believe the release of arbitrary detained individual or revelation of the fate of forced appealed person will ever happen without a political transition process. We appreciate that the mechanism of missing person recently formed by the UN General Assembly. It's a step in the right direction, and will play a pivotal role in advocating for the issue of forcibly disappeared person in Syria. We at Syrian Network for Human Rights, as you know, Qutaiba, we have extensive discussion with the High Commissioner, and we are a partner with the High Commissioner since 2011. We shared a lot of data about casualties, and we will do the same with the missing mechanism. We'll share our database, but however, there will be no significant process on this issue without a real political support and pressure from influential countries working within the new mechanism. I have, before recommendation, yeah, okay.
I would actually like to little to this. So, in consideration of this.
Can someone tell them that we need a microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot.
So in the absence of real willingness from the Syrian government and the Assad regime to really release the fate of those who are missing, from the estimate that yes, Assad has been quote unquote whitening those detention centers for quite a few years right now inside Naya and other locations. How do we fill this gap between now we have an institution for the missing, and how do we reconcile with the reality that Assad is not going to deliver anything, whether to this institution mechanism or any other mechanism in place? How do we deliver something positive to the families of those 155,000 Syrians? Positive as in the sense whether it is that your relative is alive, or that is, there is a grave, as Mariam Hallaq mentions, there is a grave where you can actually visit the body of your loved one.
I don't think Assad will cooperate with the mechanism, neither the other parties. The HTS will cooperate, or the SDF, or the National Army, because I think they are involved in killing people via torture. What we can do actually, and I always keen about the to sustain the expectation. That's the essential things. The mechanism doesn't have the power to pressure Assad to cooperate or pressure on the other parties as well. So I think the mechanism can play another role. For example, gathering a lot of families, collecting more information, trying to work for future about the graves and all of that. But at this stage, as I mentioned, without a political movement, without a real pressure, no parties, not only Assad, will cooperate with this mechanism. We need to be frank and honest with our people. I don't think in the near future the mechanism will be able to reveal the fate of the missing person in Syria.
Thank you, Fadel. Dr. Talal Sumbuli, from the interventions, we've listened to the issue clearly of refugee return is on the minds of many. Not only the plus 50 Syrian communities in diaspora today outside of Syria, but also in the minds of many governments, whether governments in the region who are reconciling with Assad in the hope that there will be a process where refugees could return, or also in the minds of governments who are worried about this environment that pushes refugees to go back to nothing probably but their death. In light of that, from the work that the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity has been doing, what types of abuses have you been witnessing or documenting that refugees are facing, especially the ones that forces them to return to Syria? And how do regime legislation practices, especially by security and military apparatuses, are impacting specifically the housing, land, and property rights for those refugees who want to return?
Thank you, Qutaiba, and thank you for the speakers. What I heard was very pleasing, and I'm grateful for that. The preparation I did mainly to respond to your question in relation with the horrific reality that the refugee will face at the time they come back to Syria. And now I hear from majority of the speaker that it is a fact. It's a reality that everybody agreed on it. And I understand that King Abdullah yesterday, he indicated himself, Abdullah II, yesterday indicated that the situation in Syria is not safe for refugee to come back to Syria. So that was great. Although the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity did quite a bit of work in that line. It was established about 2017, and the study it did inside Syria, in the area covered by the regime, understand the regime itself. And I was really myself stunned to see extensive study done in Syria from a group of individuals and able to report the fact from Syria. So I went a little bit farther than that, and I asked, how did you do it? Did you do it by telephone? Did you do it by... They said they have network of individuals. They went either inside Syria or somehow that in Syria, in the area covered by the regime itself. Up to about 5,000 member that was interviewed, personally interviewed. And this took place 4 years from 2019 to 2022. And the fact is very revealing, obviously, because now it's a fact. But I'd say a few things about it. The first one, that the Syrian themselves, overwhelming majority, irrespective of their background. They're refugee, they came back, they're settled, they have reconciliation, they are being pardoned by the government. All of them, over 50%, they don't feel safe. They don't feel secure. They don't have a calm in their mind at the time they go to bed to sleep. If we take about those who just came from outside, this will be about 67 to 72% of them, they don't feel safe. If we talk about the individual under reconciliation, and I remind you, reconciliation is an agreement being sponsored by Russia between those inhabitants in Syria rising against the Syrian regime and the Syrian regime. And the main example for them is Daraa. In those one that they have an agreement sponsored by Russia with the regime, 94% of them, they're afraid, they're insecure because the potential of something harmful is being done for them. That's way unbelievable. So it's good to hear that the majority now of us feel that it's a fact. If we add to that, to this kind of situation, that killing, assassination, disappearance from the street, those militia are running around with the point to be able to check on those coming back and forth, extract money and so forth. All of this alluded and added to the fact that Syrians in general don't have a feeling of comfort and they're afraid to live to Syria. And this is nothing new. This has been going on for the last 50 years or so. The second issue in relation to their property, especially for those one who is outside or in prison or wanted by the regime, is either confiscated or being sold. Let me just go to three categories. The first category is organization done by the regime itself to be able to look at those who did not come back or who is still outside, and they kind of give them certain label, their property will be confiscated. The second one, a court called terrorist court or terrorism court. Those will be labeled anyone the regime feel in their mind that deserves for something to be done, like for example, it did not enlist into the regime military. The second one, he ran away from the services, or he went out of the country afraid from the regime. Those will be put to the court, to the terrorist court, and their property will be confiscated. And third one is related to a variety of places the regime will call as informal or irregular. And if those of us who's been looking and watching, there being a fire in Damascus and other area, and it happened to be taken an area that it is historical, and people take hold of it and it's dearly to their heart, and this will be ruined. The regime will have after that his ability to do anything he wants with it. Let me remind you with something happened 3 months ago in, if you remember what we call the death boat. That means those refugees went to the sea in a boat that unsafe and they drowned. 160 individuals from Daraa itself were drowned in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. Those individuals, this is what the point is, those individuals happen to be the one have reconciliation between the regime and themselves, and sponsored by Russia. That to give you a clear idea that regime cannot be trusted, and Russia obviously cannot be trusted.
So even those who reconciled, who wanted to return, they eventually found themselves having, to
taken.
Syria.
Yes, 72%. Yes, this is the fact. And to a point now, those who really have property in Syria, what they see, what's happening to the other one. An example, farmland in Homs, in Hama, in Deir ez-Zor, and in obviously in Reef Dimashq, farmland is being taken by the state, by Assad regime. They put it for auction. The owner is out of the country. The relative, which in the country, they cannot even participate in the auction, and they just have to watch. And the property will be sold most of the time to the loyalists of the regime, to the militia, Iranian or Hezbollah, and the money will be taken by the government. So what happened with this one? People who have property, they see what happened to the other property, they will start doing what? Selling. And I've seen myself, individuals that are afraid that the government will take their property and they will sell it in a price much below what's supposed to be done. The conclusion from that, the first one is the regime is trying his best to delay any kind of political settlement. Why he's delaying that? The time is not on the Syrian side. The more delay, the more likelihood that the family of the Syrian refugee, they would stay where they are, being in Germany, in Turkey, in United States, or in Europe in general, even in Jordan, which is terrible, the situation, the economic situation, because they are afraid. So the first one is to delay that as much as possible. And this is not to our advantage. And the second one I want to say at this point is let's get firm on the idea refugee, they cannot come back to Syria unless the situation is changing. The third one, any political engagement with the Syrian regime, it brings no good. And the fact what we see on the ground now, that the last shipment of Captagon was sent to United States Emirates just about 10 days from now, after they talk about the regime reconciliation. If Qutaiba could give me a chance, there is a story, take about one minute. If you feel.
If we, in like 10 seconds.
Yes. Two physicians came to the United States in 1970. One of them want to go back to Syria in 1979. He stuck because he failed. The other one, he wanted to go to Syria. He was assistant professor in pediatric. He went to Ma'arat al-Na'man and he want to serve the country. So he stayed about 1 year after that. The police came and took him. He went to the prison for 21 years. 21 years. And I witnessed that. His son he came back here because citizen of the United States. So at the time, the situation improved with SAMS. There is a physician that used to go to Syria on a regular basis, and Bashar would meet with them. An idea came to one of them. He said, well, let the son of this gentleman write a letter to Bashar that I'm so and so is my father being there for 21 years. Please release him. And those individuals, the physician met with Bashar, they took the letter and gave it to Bashar. Bashar took his up and took the telephone and make a telephone call over the night. The second day, the man was out. That tell you the life of Syrian is worth nothing for the regime. That tell you those did nothing for them to be in jail. And they tell you the only way that they could do it if they could benefit by somebody recognize them what they do. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Beth Van Cock, last but not least for sure. We went through all the trend of continuous violations now in the second decade in Syria. Some of our respective government representatives also went through the tools that exist. National reports, universal jurisdiction, COI, IIM, IIMP, and they are setting precedent for other causes as well. What tools do we still have in this complete absence of accountability for the Assad regime, for other criminals? What tools do we have in place to pursue more accountability or some accountability in Syria, especially in light of the current engagements we see with the Assad regime?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for being here. And it's been really amazing to be on this panel. I've learned a ton. It's a very important conversation, and we cannot forget the Syrian people with all of the other crises around the world. So it's always good to come back, reconnect, and focus our attention again on what more can be done. I know it's probably very easy to feel quite disappointed in the international community and in the system of international justice with the entrenched impunity that we have seen with respect to Syria. But I'd like to end on a somewhat positive note, which is to just linger a bit on some of the glimmers of justice that we've heard a little bit about this afternoon. We've heard about universal jurisdiction cases. So Germany really took the lead, and I want to express my admiration and support for what your prosecutors have done, really trying to enliven and re-enliven the principle of universal jurisdiction. That has had an impact with respect to Syrian survivors, because some very senior members of the Assad regime have now been held responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, also more junior members. But then there are reverberations where other prosecutors around the world see that it can be done, acknowledging that these cases are hard. They're involving events that are far away. You have witnesses that need translation. The prosecutors don't understand the political context in which these violations are happening. And yet they see what Germany has done and they realize that it can be done in their own system. So we're seeing cases involving Liberia, involving the Gambia, involving Iran, all based upon the same legal theories. And these judges and prosecutors are in contact with each other. They're having conversations with each other. They're strategizing together. So while any one particular case is only able to respond to a particular incident or the experience of a subset of, and a very often very tiny subset of victims and survivors, there are these reverberations. And these cases are strengthening now the system of international justice globally. I think even our own prosecutors in the Department of Justice, who have the brief of international crimes, are watching very carefully what's happening and thinking to themselves, okay, what can we do now in our own system with the legal authorities we have and with the jurisdictional reach that we have? I'd also like to linger a minute on the case that has been brought by the Netherlands and Canada before the International Court of Justice under the Convention on Torture. This is an incredibly important case. It will get at the question of state responsibility. So it's not individual criminal responsibility in the fact of holding one individual liable. It would hold the entire Assad regime responsible for an industrial system of torture. We've heard about individual cases here, but we know that those individual cases are multiplied across the entire country. And a small piece of that case has not gotten nearly enough attention, which is in the memorial that was originally filed. There was mention of the fact that the use of chemical weapons could also constitute torture. Why? Well, because the very reason one uses those types of weapons is to cause great physical and psychological suffering. Obviously, physical suffering of the direct victim themselves, but also the psychological suffering of being in a community where you realize your own government is attacking you from the air with chemicals in the hope that it will cause suffering and that will cause the communities to stand down, to stop resisting, to go underground. And so it waits to be seen to what extent the use of chemical weapons is a prominent feature of that case, but it's extremely important. And just next week, we will have the first hearing where the two states have asked for what are called provisional measures, which are essentially injunctive relief to say you have to stop the system of torture. Will the Assad regime listen? Of course not. Nonetheless, there's a symbolic power to an international court, the World Court in The Hague, the City of Justice, pronouncing that the Syrian regime needs to stop torturing individuals in its custody. So that's an extremely important development. And we've seen that happen elsewhere, where the Gambia has brought suit under the Genocide Convention against Myanmar for harm to the Rohingya people. And the theory is that any state that is a party to those treaties can bring another state party to the International Court of Justice to adjudicate their enforcement and compliance with that treaty. So that's another extremely important principle that is being strengthened by virtue of these cases. We've had a few cases in our own system. We have a Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act that withholds sovereign immunity from states that are designated as state sponsors of terrorism. That route is only available to United States citizens. So we have a real asymmetry in terms of justice in our own system under the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. But we do have the case involving Marie Colvin, who was the longtime war correspondent. She insisted upon being in Syria to cover the events. She called her home bureau. That satellite uplink was probably intercepted. And that is the theory as to how she was ultimately assassinated by the Assad regime. Her family brought suit on her behalf under the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, winning a $300 million judgment against the Syrian state, proving that the Syrian state was deliberately targeting the media centers who were trying to shed a light on what was happening within Syria. So these are, I think, some bright spots. And I know it may not bring great comfort to Syrian survivors, but these efforts that are happening in this multipolar world, decentralized courts, are improving the entire system. They're strengthening the entire system. They're inspiring justice advocates. And so much of these cases are really dependent upon the work of civil society. In fact, I don't think any of them could be brought without organizations like the Syrian Network for Human Rights, the Syrian Archives, et cetera. These are the organizations that are on the ground. They're collecting evidence to a criminal law standard. They're accompanying witnesses. They're helping to identify perpetrators at the local Arab market. They're developing trusted relationships with law enforcement and having the courage to come forward to speak with prosecutors and investigators and say, I saw a guy at the market. he tortured me, or I know I recognize him. I know he held a position within the Syrian state. And those types of initiatives from civil society, from survivors groups, are what is empowering our law enforcement agencies to be willing to take a risk on these cases. And so this is another, I think, consequence of this conflict, is these really fruitful partnerships that we're seeing now between survivors and law enforcement. So these are just a few tools that we have. Obviously, they need to be strengthened. They need to proliferate. They need to be used more often. But we are seeing some glimmers of justice, even when the international community has not done nearly enough to promote justice here.
I want to thank you so much. I think this glimpse of hope is important, because while the Assad regime is still there, the clock is not going to turn back for 2011, where the Assad regime is back into the international media. It's just a matter of time when accountability is going to happen, not a matter of if it's going to happen. I want to thank you all for being part of this panel, as well as our Syrian society partners, and all of you actually for being here today with us in person and online. Please follow the work of SNHR and the fellow Syrian civil society organizations, the Syrian Association for Citizens' Dignity and Multi-Faith Alliance. And thanks again.
Yeah, next thing. Okay, see you back. Headquarters.